So getting hold of someone from council can help you get a more closer snapshot of your regional ecosystem on your place. And another interesting thing you can do through that EPH website is to do a WildNet search on your place. And that would give all the faunal and faunal records that have been recorded around your place for a while. So that's a really interesting thing to do as well, because you know, when we're planting and we know there might be Richmond birdwing butterflies in your area, for instance. And so in your plantings, you might want to be considering that if you've got the right sort of vegetation already, of adding in host plants for those species that are threatened.
This cutting has proved quite a challenge. We're just about getting control of this east-facing side. I mean, it's subsoil. And I planted heavily with lamandra at that end, up the top, and it's gradually, well, you can see the lamandra which is seeded up there is spreading down the slope. So this, at the end of last wet season, was absolutely covered in silverleaf desmodium. We took a whole ute load of silverleaf desmodium off it. It was appalling. But it's coming under control now.
You've got your ground cover, you've got shrubby vegetation, you've got woody debris. And you've of course got your canopy. And so, you know, when a Lamphur wildlife officer comes around to your place, we'll be talking about habitat under restoration or retained habitat.
Another thing, as we go along, you'll see piles of dry debris. We do not remove any material from the forest.
No.
If it's in the way of what we're doing, we might stack it like that, but it stays there.
Yeah. And you'll see often when bush regenerators come through clearing lantana from sites, is that they'll make those piles as they go. I've fondly named those piles barungs, because everywhere barung goes, you see those little piles, so they're barungs now. And when we're looking at lantana, we'll talk about why we pile those up, and there's numerous reasons for it. But we'll talk about that when we're... Yeah.
Actually, the brush turkeys haven't started to use them though, Ed. That's the only trouble. They build their own.
When I was working at Barung, we identified it as Paspalum wettisteinii, which we thought it was, but then found out that no, that was wrong. You know, we were just starting to see it. And this grass here I'm talking about, and it was introduced as a horticultural understory plant, so for tree crops. This was brought in to be a ground cover under tree crops. So unfortunately it's shade tolerant. And what I've seen and what I'm seeing everywhere is where this grass becomes established, it absolutely chokes out any native regeneration, any tree recruitment, any diversity in the understory. It becomes a monoculture of this stuff. And this grass alarms me because as Joan and John have been saying, you know, their work has reduced because they've got a closed canopy. But this is going to get in anyway.
I've got it in the costume.
So if you have this around and you are starting to work, and like at my place I've learnt that while I've got lantana, I haven't got this growing. So I make sure I get this away from where I'm going to clear lantana first, because I don't want to swap my lantana for paspalum. I don't want to swap my lantana for silverleaf desmodium.
Should we spray this?
Well,
I had to remove that because of the ferns that can naturally establish it.
Like in this area here, and under the principles of bush regen, when we've got these little understory plants here, it's really important that we do whatever we can to retain these. You're going to kill some things when you're working. You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. But really, once you start, and like here's a little morinda vine here, just going up, and once you start, and you start to pull out, you know, and ideally I'd have an old garden knife or something here just to help me get those roots. But once you actually start pulling them out from around your natives, you think, there's nothing left for me to spray now, I might as well pull these.
You can keep going in if you like. But this is something I need to really start thinking about. It's not a weed I've really worried about too much to date, but clearly it's one I will have
It's
to
one
think
I'm
about
quite
more.
alarmed about, and I guess with weed control, don't ever underestimate the value of hand weeding.
No.
Good old hand weeding is so good. When I go out at home, what I take, I've got a little tool belt, and it's really just a belt, and it's made of shade cloth. It's just folded up in itself, and it's like a little pouch, like a carpenter's nail bag. In that, I'll have often just a blade screwdriver, a big stevie, because I'd be using that screwdriver to push in and just loosen those roots up out of the soil. I have a knife, an old garden knife, which I use to scrape on stems to introduce glyphosate at 1:1, and I'll have sometimes a sauce bottle with a label that says glyphosate, of course, do not drink, at 1 part water, 1 part glyphosate, and that's all I'll need, and I'll be able to tackle just about anything I'll find on my place, you know, with something to be able to dig in and loosen up things, something to be able to scrape a stem and introduce a little bit of glyphosate that way, and very rarely will I spray. Most of the time, you know, sometimes with a pair of secateurs, if I can't dig this out, I'll just hack this back like this and maybe just damp a bit of glyphosate on the end stump. Sometimes that'll grow back, a lot of the times it won't.
Yeah, no, that's very, very good advice. When an old wattle tree falls down, it brings a whole lot of vines with it, you just leave it there, and its habitat, it'll all eventually rot and fall to the ground. You don't worry about it, just leave it.
In a lot of gardens where everything's neat and tidy, we don't have small bird diversity. You know, what our little birds need, and Susie probably knows more about this than I do, is stuff like this. You know, where you've got this complex of vegetation that's all tangled up and thorny and prickly and gnarly, and if you like, a little bit sort of messy looking. That's what a lot of our little critters really need.
Now we have a slip down there which happened about 2 years ago, and it's just, it's not a very long one, but it just dropped, clear soil. So I thought, right, all I can do with that, because it's very steep and physically be a bit difficult for me to get at it, is to lay jute mat and plant lavender into it and stabilise it that way. Now, for reasons of other family activities, weather, etc., I couldn't get to it. So by the time it was beginning to get urgent to acquit the grant, I had a look at it and I thought, the jute mat is not going to work, because while I had been doing nothing to it, the native raspberry had invaded, my favourite hard maidenhair fern had invaded, and clearly if I was going to put jute mat, I would have to completely kill all that natural regeneration. So I rapidly consulted council and said, look, I've got a problem here, I'll have to alter it. So council said, okay, that's all right, you can use the money to pay labour to actually weed, strategically weed and plant lavender into the slip. And that is what's happened. So we will go down and have a look from the top. It's a bit dicey to go down the bottom. It's not very long or very, very deep, but it was a physically difficult area for me to get to. So if you will find at times you will have to change your plans quite radically, and council's very amenable to changes. They'll come out and look at it and say, yes, that's okay, or what have you thought of doing, whatever. But it's a great example of how natural regeneration can take place remarkably quickly and actually save you a hell of a lot of work. So we'll pop down and have a look. I mentioned when we were looking at the slip down there, the rotational slips, which this country is well known. A good example is the house is up there. There's the first of the slips. Comes down, makes a mound, goes down the slope, you get another slip further down, and then there's another one in a neighbour's place. They're not big slips, but it's just the country moves like that. And sometimes it can be relatively hard to establish things in the hollows. There's a moisture problem. But I planted these calitras, which are not native to this particular area, the Bribie Island pine. I'll have to admit I planted them because I love calitras. Yes. And they've done a great deal better than the forest chio. But they're a great quality. And they've probably hung on to the bank. I'm sure they've hung on to the bank.
You can just see the cracks in the soil, and that's, you know, as it dries out and cracks and swells again when it gets wet, that's, you know, just generating that movement, you know, so cracking soil is very prone to slip.
It's been a great example of how the soil will only support a certain number of trees as far as the moisture is concerned. So most of the vegetation along here is natural. I did plant some things, most of which died from lack of water. But the forest grasses come in and stabilised it. I don't need to hand weed this side at all. And the other side was heavily infested with lantana, and for the last 2 years it virtually needed no additional hand weeding. But it's been a hand weeding job, it's been a steep slope. But it's now stabilised, and this gully line is our major movement corridor for our small birds. They come up from our neighbour's place, up this gully and into the garden. On this side, that dry bank, which has been hard to plant because of the soil moisture, was absolutely solid lantana. And John in fact got the tractor in. We could bring it in from the road at that point in time, and we sort of unrolled the lantana. We sort of loosened at the top and rolled it down the slope, and then literally dragged it out, and it had to be burned in piles, that particular issue. But since then, it's been stabilising itself. I've done some planting, and gradually it's just sorting itself out. But as you walk up this little track into the garden, and we'll work our way back up to the shed, look down that slope, and there's a great example of how the land has essentially sorted itself out. The angle of the gully has reached its natural repose for those soils, and the understory grasses have come in, and it doesn't need any work. I planted this very, very useful sprawling shrub, the Regeneration arena. That's a very, very handy shrub to use. It just wanders around and sprawls and gradually spreads. Awkward slope, and you need to hold the soil. There's nothing like lamandra, but it will do its own thing over a period of time, so you don't need to sort of masticate the whole thing. In other words, allow the natural regeneration to occur. It will.
One of the
That's just all completely held now in, say, hundreds of lamandra.
One of the important lessons about things like this is don't get impatient. If you're prepared to wait, you can save yourself a lot of work, and it's very interesting to watch what's happening.
What you've got to do is you've got to come up with a strategy and a plan about how you're going to go about it. And like, see the line of little trees there? Up the middle? Just poking over the lantana?
Oh yeah.
That's where you'd start. You just weed from around there and just slowly and gradually weed out, and under the principles of bush regeneration, we weed out and keep that maintained, and watch all the little native seedlings come up, go back, re-weed it, and then when the natives are dominant, push on and do the next little bit. And it happens surprisingly quickly. And so you've just got to be strategic, persistent, and remember to follow up. What's this stuff?
I brought you across here because this is a wonderful example of having killing a tree, leaving it in situ, and letting things happen underneath it. Now, for years, this is the only big camphor laurel on this property, because this is really not camphor laurel country. They're further down. But we left it. We left it there for years. It really wasn't spreading much. It wasn't doing much damage, and we didn't have time to get to it. When we started working on this area, we had Jolyon poison it for us, and just left it there, and the birds perched in it, and this is what's come up underneath. All these, well, now medium-sized trees. I did hand weed amongst them for 2 or 3 years, just to keep the vines down. But as I said earlier, I literally have not been here for 2 years. It sounds ridiculous in a block this size, but didn't get here. And in the meantime, we've still got some vines. Clearly we've got a problem with the weeds on that side, but it's now forming a fairly stable edge.
This is our neighbour's weeds.
It is our neighbour's weeds. It's nothing to do with weeds. But that is what has happened by leaving that tree in situ and allowing the birds to perch and drop seeds.
So Joan,
And the
while the tree was growing, was there this regeneration underneath it?
No, it was pretty well bare underneath it.
It was
Yes.
bare out to about where Bill is.
Yes. Yeah.
So is that what happens underneath the camphor
Yes.
laurel?
With
Nothing
lots
grows.
of baby camphor laurels?
Baby camphor laurels, yes, there were a few, but there really wasn't much under it. No.
So camphor laurels and some of our eucalyptus, some plants, they have a mechanism that stop other plants growing around them. It's called allelopathy, you know, like pawpaws have a mechanism that stops their seed generating until it's soaked and washed off. So there's, for different reasons, plants have that, but with so they stop other plants growing around. On waterways, that same chemical process actually gets into the waterways and kills the macroinvertebrates that live in the stream bed that process the nutrients, like the decaying organic matter. So they have pretty severe impacts on water quality.
So,
Yes.
that's right.
I should really get rid of the camphor laurel at an early stage.
Yes. Yeah. And if you have got a big one, don't despair, because you can do this.
Yes.
And if you really are going to miss the shade long term, you can, you know, put a strangler fig in there. Just get a strangler fig seedling with a bit of humus and leaf litter, tie it up with a stocking, and that fig will replace the canopy that you've lost. But yes, if you've got camphor laurels on your place, it's easy to deal with them when they're little.
One of your advantages of leaving your litter on the ground, you get all these fungi. Now, if you need to know the name of a fungus, Christian will tell you.
No, I won't. But according to Fran, this is always under Elaeocarpus grandis. It likes Elaeocarpus grandis fish. But it does occur in other things.
And so when we were talking, you know, one of the things we first started speaking about was how important it was, you know, that you understand your place and what soil you have there, and you know, aim to grow the vegetation that has evolved there, because very often, as Gretchen's just pointed out, there's all these subtle little associations that we don't realise about, that we're only just starting to find out about. And that, you know, there's an association between the blue quandong and a certain fungus. There's associations between acacias and certain funguses. There's associations between a lot of the allocasuarinas and certain funguses. And so that's one of the reasons why it always pays to stick with what belongs in your place, because, you know, even science doesn't know about a lot of these associations, but they're there, and if you're trying to work outside of your natural system, you're having to input a whole lot more resources, whether it be water, fertiliser, time, to get things to happen. But if you're working with your natural systems, magic happens.
Yes, it certainly does. This is an area where we actually had a fairly massive natural regeneration of the macaranga. That's all these small trees. Now, about a couple of years back, it was suggested we might actually need to manually thin those because they were creating a fairly dense canopy and stopping the natural regeneration occurring. But what's actually happened is that because they're a bit spindly, they've gradually begun to die, and the black cockatoos love the grubs which invade them. So I often hear the black cockatoos over here, and I know that they are shredding a dying or dead macaranga. So the thinning has occurred of its own quite naturally. I haven't really had to think about it.
Actually, Joan's comment about the cockatoos is worth another little story, which matches my "don't be impatient" comment before. Over on the big ficus virens behind our home, which you'll see later on, it had a lot of cockspur, and big cockspur, really big cockspur, that we started to try and organise from the ground up, and I tried to pull the cockspur out of the fig, and it was almost impossible. Within about 2 years, and with a lot of happy black cockatoos, an invasion of the wood-boring grubs, the cockatoos had had a feast, they'd multiplied, and the cockspur was on the ground as a mulch and the tree was clean.
Waterline grubs are in the cockspur.
Yeah.
Cockspur,
Oh yeah.
wattles, macarangas, yes.
And it was marvellous. I didn't have to climb the tree, and it was just being revealed to us by courtesy of these lovely big blackbirds.
So they saved you from acupuncture for Regeneration.
It's interesting to look at here, because after a few years of fairly careful hand weeding, and I do far more hand weeding and spraying. I spray mist flower if it's in monoculture patches. That's about the only thing I do spray. There's very little lantana weeds, and as you walk through you see a little bit of moss vine. There's some fairly open lantana. On that side we've got our creek. This side is an ephemeral gully. And even on that side, which is quite steep, when we did the planting, that was an absolute mass of lantana and completely impossible to deal with because it's very, very steep. It's almost all gone, just of its own accord. It's been shaded out.
That's a function of altering the microclimate. So this planting up here has changed the light regime, changed humidity and everything, which has made it unfavourable for the lantana to persist there. And if you carefully have a look over the edge there, you'll just see what's happened on the ground, and there's a massive fern diversity and ground covers that have come just because this revegetation here has built a new microclimate and allowed those things to come in and become established.
And that's been really good because that's a fairly inaccessible area. So what we did up here has saved work down there. Which has been brilliant. Right. Well, this afternoon what we're going to do is go across continue along the road, across the back here.
Most of you have already been over there.
Yes, well, we've had an occasional footstep, sorry about that. And we'll cut across towards our eastern boundary, where we're working with our neighbour. And basically look down on a new planting, see where it joins to an existing edge, which is remnant with really good sort of ground cover of grasses and so forth. So it's an area I don't have to do much with, beyond the occasional bit of mist flower. There's an area which has been recently planted and it has the barung mulch piles. And then there's a line which is solid lantana. And it was interesting going across there the other day to check on the bandicoot damage, to see a whole lot of little birds in the lantana. I wasn't quite sure what they were. They were possibly finches. They may have been model flycatchers. I wasn't yet sure. But anyway, it just showed that the lantana is really habitat for those small birds. And then we'll move around our eastern boundary where this land slips. It's the junction of the basalt onto the grey clay, and that's where it moves, and there's usually seepage. And there's one section, there's an absolute sheer cliff between us and our neighbour. I looked up at it from his place the other day and thought, gods. And then we'll move around to an old slip and look at it from the perspective of how we would deal with the presently lantana infested area with natural regeneration, where we would start. And that'll take us probably an hour at the end of the day. So we're basically building on what we did this morning and looking at a newer area. The Iliocarpus obovatus, the suckering one, that was original, the Ficus barons is original. But a lot of the stuff in the foreground is actually planted, but again, over time, it just formed a canopy and no longer needed any attention, and we've got stuff coming up in behind it. And then this is the next row. And what I'm doing here, because when we originally built, we had a lot of weeds, we had a lot of grassland birds, so the wrens and all sorts of small birds were around, and they went, and they're living next door actually, once we started building a rainforest canopy. Fair enough. So what I'm going to do here, in this open area, which is part of our view from the house, I'm going to re-establish grassland and low shrubs as an experiment. It's going to be quite challenging because we've got this very dense pasture grass. So what I'll have to do is kill sections, probably circles, or move out from that edge over there because that was, we had 2 remnant trees in there, and then we planted around them and established that. I can move out from that edge, move from that edge, and gradually establish a more open, deliberate habitat production area. We'll see how it goes, but it is going to require a lot of searching for the right species, finding the right species,
Working out how to grow them.
working out how to grow them, but I mean, I like doing that sort of thing.
Keeping them alive.
There's just a few things that come out of that. Joan says probably circles. And I mean, shape about your re-veg is really important. So we've got this sort of area to edge ratio, and you've heard us talk a few times today about edges. In the edge, like, I don't know, if you want to go fishing and you've got shallow water, deep water, that's where all the fish are, on the edge of the drop off. In nature, and on the ecotone, or the edge between 2 different ecosystems, is the most active and the most productive. In horticulture, where we have the edge of our crop and the edge of our non-cropping area, it's actually the most labour intensive area to look after. And the same in re-veg. So the more edge we have compared to area under management, the more work we've got to do. And so by having circles or big fat round areas with a relatively low edge ratio, we'll reduce our work and create that microclimate a lot quicker than a long skinny strip. One thing, if you can, always try and avoid long skinny strips. They're a lot harder and a lot more work to deal with.
Is there a hardy native grass that would sort of survive in this sort of...
Oh, there's a couple, like normally our, like, you know, Thermida grass is a good one, Thermida australis, barbed wire grass, Simna pagan refractus, a lot of those, you know, grassland understory things, Elastostachyx, wiry panics, and the wiry panics would probably do better under the sort of shade creeping out with the Thermida and the barbed wire grass. Native sorghum is a big tall growing grass. It's really good habitat for birds. So if you go to the Bunya Mountains, a really interesting place to check out is the grassy balds there, and they're like surrounded by rainforest, but they're just little funny little grasslands, and they're really quite amazing places.
But this is putting into practice all the things we talked about this morning.
So there's our transition between what is pretty stable forest with the grassy understory, very little weed growth in there now, occasionally with the grass. And this is the newest planting. As you can see, almost every tree now has a wallaby gar. And the bandicoots have been ploughing that slope. It's just been incredible. Periodically digging these trees up and slinging them and burying them to the ground. So I spend an hour every morning dealing with bandicoots. However, you can see that our 2 revegetators have left all the picturesque because it's great habitat, the birds love it, provides lots of food, and they've heavily mulched everything that's been planted down the slope. So we restricted it to between that bit and the lantana over there. And they will come back this year and do the maintenance on that before we do anything, we go any further.
So babe, oh sorry.
But it's the eastern front of this area, behind this vegetation, where we're working with our next door neighbour, whose goal is for us to have a living boundary. He doesn't want a fence, nor do we. And they're clearing the rubbish out of their area, and we're revegetating it together.
But when you put the lantana like this on the floor, does it not restrict by itself?
Well, we break it up. You'll see that the lantana is broken up into, you know, bits about this long. If you don't break the lantana up into small bits, there's enough stored energy in that plant there for it to grow those adventitious roots in the right weather conditions. You know, when it's dry like this, it's not as likely. So we tend to break it up into small bits, which just robs it of its reserve energy. And I got taught a great lesson about dealing with lantana. Years ago, I used to be a brush hook man. Used to get in there with my brush hook and just chop it down. And then one day I had the opportunity to work beside a CVA team. That was all girls, all women, and a woman team leader.
Explain CVA.
which is Conservation Volunteers Australia. And these girls come out and they're all in long pants and long sleeve shirts like this, and they put on their gloves and they very merrily started to chat away, and as they were chatting they just started to snap up lantana with their gloved hands, throwing it into their neat little piles. When it got a bit hard to snap, they pulled out their secateurs and just snip, snip. They're looking at all the birds and they're talking away. Me and my mates are getting scratched and all hot and sweaty, and these girls are having a great time. After a week, I thought they're never going to get anywhere. And at the end of the week, they had done more than what we'd done. And what I was really impressed about, at the end of 6 months, you went into where we'd done it, our way with the brush hooks, and it was like we'd never done anything. And where they'd done it, this way, there was hardly any lantana regrowing, because they'd actually cleaned the ground, taken care of all those little adventitious roots. They'd actually enjoyed themselves and looked at the birds and, yeah, what a great place to be, whereas we'd grunted away and sweated. Now there is a place, you know, if you've got big thickets...
There's a place for a brush hook still.
There is. I was just going there, Bill. Like if you've got great big areas of lantana, you've got to chunk it up into tracts, and so you've got to get around and access it. So you still have to do a bit of brush hooking.
But the other important thing, I think, is the way you've cut it off and left some up in the air, because it's got nowhere to go.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
Yes, and
that's
again,
right.
Take away its ground.
the grubs and the cockatoos will feed out.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful tree for regeneration because it suckers and coppices. This is Eliocarpus obovatus, the hard quandong, very hard to germinate. If you can get hold of it, it is well worth having because it just spreads and it really holds the soil because it just keeps on going.
There's the parent tree, the big one behind.
The big one, that's the parent, and basically all of this stuff is new. It was covered in glycine, and our youngest son removed the glycine, and since then it's just gradually spread. And I'm certainly encouraging. There's a Caesalpinia vine in there with a really corky bark. It has flanges about that deep. It flowers once a year with masses of yellow. So there's a vine there, there's a range of different trees in there, there's some understory. It's good mixed habitat with all the layers.
So while we're all gathered, I'd just like to really thank Joan and John for opening up their home and property and sharing their experience with us today. So thanks, guys.